I knew things would go terribly wrong the moment I saw the HOA president speeding across the lake in my boat while screaming at her board members that she had finally caught me breaking community rules, but the real comedy started when every neighbor watched her flex her imaginary power without knowing that the entire lake, the water, the docks, and every square foot under her feet legally belonged to me, and the moment she bragged that she had confiscated this boat for the good of the HOA, I already knew I was about to let her dig a hole so deep she wouldn't be able to climb out even with all her petty community rulebooks combined. The morning had started peacefully with the kind of calm that makes you forget that somewhere in your neighborhood there is always a person whose life purpose is to enforce rules no one agreed to, and in my case, that person was Karen, the HOA president, with a whistle that she wore like a badge of honor and a clipboard full of imaginary authority. I was on my dock preparing a few fishing rods when her voice bounced across the water like an angry crow, yelling something about unauthorized lake usage and suspicious behavior, which was hilarious considering I was literally the owner of the lake she was yelling about. She marched toward my property with 2 board members trailing behind her like confused ducklings, all puffed up and ready to issue warnings they had no right to give, but before I could even greet her, she pointed at my boat and demanded to know why it had not been registered with the HOA Lake Patrol, which, by the way, did not legally exist but she liked to pretend it did. I simply told her I was going fishing, but that apparently wasn't enough because she then claimed that my boat was drifting too close to the community shoreline and could cause environmental harm, even though the boat was literally tied to my private dock. Instead of arguing, I decided to let her brilliant genius unfold naturally, so when she yelled that she was confiscating my boat until a full investigation was completed, I stepped back and let her take it, watching her climb in like she was taking command of a warship. The neighbors who were out for their morning walks stopped and stared as she untied it clumsily, nearly falling into the lake twice before she managed to start the engine, but the moment it roared to life she acted like she had conquered some great evil and began driving away while shouting across the water that this was what happened when people disrespected HOA authority. I kept a straight face, though inside I was laughing so hard it physically hurt, because letting her take the boat was going to be the best mistake she'd ever make. As she sailed off, she started lecturing the air about safety violations, noise pollution, and the dangers of unregulated lake use, and the board members clapped like she had just saved the community from a natural disaster, but I simply folded my arms and watched, knowing full well she had no idea she was now trespassing on private property on a vehicle she had technically stolen. I casually called the county sheriff's office and told them there was a theft in progress involving my boat and someone operating it without permission on my privately owned lake, and the dispatcher needed a full minute to process the sentence before asking for clarification because apparently it sounded too ridiculous to be real. I confirmed everything with documentation they already had on file, the land deed, the lake rights, and the water usage agreement, and they said they would send someone right away because unauthorized operation of a watercraft on private water is, in fact, a big legal problem. Meanwhile, Karen started circling the lake like she was on patrol duty, shouting at ducks for swimming too close to the community beach, lecturing a fisherman on the opposite side that he needed HOA approval to cast a line, and filming every little thing she saw as evidence of rule breaking that she believed would strengthen her imaginary case against me. I sat on my dock drinking iced tea, enjoying the free entertainment. The neighbors were gathering too, whispering, laughing, pointing, some recording videos, and one old man on his porch yelled that she was about to meet God if she didn't slow down because she was driving the boat like a toddler playing with a toy. When the sheriff finally pulled up in his vehicle near my dock, I waved him over and simply pointed at the boat zooming around like a confused mosquito. He squinted, sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that says he has dealt with HOA drama all his career, and walked to the edge of the dock, where he radioed in the situation, confirming that the operator of the boat had no legal right to it or the water she was currently navigating. The sheriff asked me if I wanted to press charges immediately or wait until she returned, but I told him I wanted her to come back on her own, so the shock of realization hit her as hard as possible. A few neighbors clapped quietly. As Karen looped around the lake one last time like she was leading a military parade, she steered back toward my dock with the dramatic intensity of someone who believed she had completed a noble mission. She parked terribly, scraping the side of the boat along the dock, then stood proudly with her hands on her hips and announced that my boat was now in HOA custody. The sheriff stepped forward slowly, and the look on her face as she realized who was standing there would become one of the greatest moments of my life. Karen froze in place like someone had just unplugged her brain, her confident smile collapsing instantly as the sheriff stepped closer and asked her to confirm her name, her role, and why she was operating a boat that did not belong to her on a lake she did not have rights to, and she stammered so badly that for a moment it looked like she had forgotten both her name and the concept of language altogether. The neighbors stood silently, some pretending to look at their lawn, others recording discreetly, waiting for the fuse to burn down and the explosion of drama to begin. Karen attempted to regain composure and declared that as HOA president she had full authority to seize any property violating community rules, but the sheriff cut her off with the quiet tone of a man who had heard enough HOA nonsense for a lifetime and asked her to explain which law, not rule, she was citing, because HOA bylaws do not override state law, property rights, or waterway regulations. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air as she realized she had walked into a situation far more serious than she thought, and the two board members behind her slowly stepped backward, trying to distance themselves from her collapsing authority, as if they might catch humiliation by proximity. I stood there watching calmly, not out of cruelty but out of satisfaction, because this was not about revenge but about teaching her that power without limits becomes delusion, and delusion on a lake someone else owns becomes comedy. Karen tried to switch tactics and claimed that my boat was illegally parked, illegally registered, and illegally operated, and therefore she confiscated it under HOA Ordinance 19 subsection 3, which sounded official but did not actually exist. The sheriff raised an eyebrow and asked her if she realized that seizing property unlawfully could be considered theft, and operating a stolen watercraft could escalate to multiple charges, including trespassing, unauthorized operation, and reckless endangerment depending on who witnessed her joyride. She sputtered that she was only doing her job and protecting the community from dangerous individuals like me, but the sheriff turned to me and asked if I wanted him to list all the ways she had violated state water safety laws, because based on the video's neighbors were taking this was shaping up to be a case with too much evidence. I pretended to think about it, though inside I was enjoying her panic spiral, but instead of pushing charges immediately, I told the sheriff that I wanted her to explain why she thought she had authority over property outside HOA jurisdiction. Karen brightened slightly, believing she had an opening, and she began rambling a dramatic speech about how the community depended on her leadership, how people constantly tried to break rules, how she alone maintained order, and how I was undermining her by ignoring HOA directives, completely unaware that every sentence she said sounded more unhinged than the last. When she exclaimed that the lake was part of the community ecosystem and therefore under her supervision, a collective gasp echoed through the neighbors because everyone knew the truth except her. The sheriff asked me calmly if I owned the property in question, and I nodded, handing him the same official lake deed that Karen had ignored when I tried to show it months earlier. The sheriff scanned the document, verified the survey number, acreage, water rights, shoreline rights, and everything else confirming my ownership. Finally he turned to Karen and asked if she had ever read the deed or checked the county records before seizing a boat from its legal owner on private water. Karen said nobody had ever shown her the documents and claimed the HOA had always operated under the belief that the lake was part of the shared amenities. I gently reminded her that I had shown her the documents many times, emailed them, printed them, mailed them twice, and even included them in an envelope she refused to open because she said she didn't accept mail from people who disrespected her authority. Karen went silent for a moment, trying to stitch together a defense, and finally stated that regardless of the ownership, she was acting in good faith for the safety of the neighborhood. The sheriff, now growing visibly irritated, explained slowly that good faith does not grant someone the right to commandeer a boat, drive it around recklessly, harass residents, or accuse people of crimes that do not exist. The board members stepped even farther away at this point, almost tripping over each other trying not to be associated with her meltdown. One neighbor coughed loudly and muttered that she was finished. Another whispered that she should resign before the sheriff made her. Karen snapped back to life and insisted she had no reason to resign, that she was still in control, and that she would handle this matter with the HOA lawyers. But the sheriff informed her that no lawyer could change property rights or water laws, and that she was in a lot of trouble if the owner decided to pursue charges. I told the sheriff that I had not yet made up my mind, and wanted to see what the HOA planned to do to fix the chaos she had caused. Karen smirked, thinking I was giving her mercy, but then I asked her why she was instructing neighbors to avoid fishing, boating, or swimming without her approval when she had no jurisdiction over any of it. That question broke her fake confidence like glass. She tried to justify her behavior by saying the community expected strong leadership, that people liked order, and that she was trying to prevent disasters, but every word sounded more like an excuse than an explanation. The sheriff asked her if she understood that she could be held personally responsible for damages to the boat caused while she was driving it, including the long scrape she left along the side when docking like a blindfolded pirate. Her eyes widened as she realized that this could cost her real money, something HOA presidents usually avoid paying at all costs. She turned to the board members for support, but they both looked away like children caught misbehaving. Then the sheriff delivered the blow that finally cracked her nerve completely. He asked her to hand over her ID and step aside so he could take an official statement regarding unauthorized use of a privately owned vehicle. She stepped back, trembling, unable to understand how a situation she believed would humiliate me had flipped entirely and was now threatening her reputation, her position, and possibly her bank account. Neighbors stared at her, whispering, filming, and one elderly woman who Karen had harassed for painting her mailbox too brightly whispered "Thank God" under her breath. As the sheriff continued questioning her, I watched the tension build and realized something important. Karen wasn't done fighting. She was going to double down, twist the story, weaponize fear, and try to regain control of the HOA before it all slipped away. And that meant Chapter 3 was about to get a whole lot more chaotic. Karen stood stiffly at the edge of the dock while the sheriff finished his questions, and the moment he stepped away to radio the station she immediately began whispering aggressively to the two board members, trying to recruit them back to her side as if loyalty could be reinstalled like a faulty app. They looked terrified, glancing between her and the sheriff, clearly debating whether following her any longer was worth risking their own reputations. Karen kept insisting that the situation was only a misunderstanding, that she was being targeted unfairly, that I had tricked everyone, and that the HOA would back her once they heard her version, but her voice was trembling badly and no amount of pretending could hide the panic rising behind her eyes. I watched quietly, sipping my tea, letting her scramble like a cornered raccoon, because I knew that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people expose themselves without your interference. When the sheriff walked back, Karen tried to regain her false composure and stated loudly that she needed time to prepare an official HOA report and that she expected everyone to respect her authority until the matter was resolved, but the sheriff reminded her that authority has limits, and hers stopped at the property line of the HOA, not at the water line, not at my boat, and definitely not at my lake. That comment sent the neighbors into soft murmurs, and one man in the back whispered that Head always suspected she was overstepping. Karen glared at him, then at me, then at the sheriff, and then stormed away from the dock, her shoes clacking sharply as she marched toward the HOA office like she was preparing for war. The board members reluctantly followed her, but even they looked exhausted, like soldiers forced into a battle they no longer believed in. As the crowd dispersed, several neighbors approached me quietly to apologize for the HOA's behavior, explaining that they never agreed to half the rules Karen enforced and that she had become more aggressive over the past year, adding new ordinances, imposing fines, and patrolling the neighborhood like a self-appointed dictator. One elderly man shook his head and said she once fined him for having a hose on the lawn for too long, calling it an environmental hazard. Another woman revealed that Karen refused to approve her garden because she considered flowers a distraction. It was clear that for months, maybe even years, people had been tolerating her simply because they didn't know how to stop her, and her obsession with control had finally escalated to the point of stealing a boat. I assured them that I wasn't out for revenge, only justice and community sanity, and that everything was now in motion to stop her from repeating this kind of nonsense. As the sheriff took additional statements from the neighbors, I walked back to my house to prepare documents that I knew would become important very soon. Karen would not surrender power peacefully. People like her never do. Instead, they double down, twist the narrative, rewrite the truth, and hope that fear can rebuild whatever authority they lost. So I gathered every email I had ever sent her, every letter, every recorded voicemail where she insisted the lake was HOA controlled, every witness statement from neighbors who heard her false claims, and all legal documentation proving my ownership. I wasn't preparing these out of anger, but out of necessity, because Karen was about to launch a counterattack fueled entirely by denial, pride, and desperation. Sure enough, not even an hour passed before the HOA sent out a neighborhood-wide emergency meeting alert, claiming that there was a serious violation threatening community safety, and that all members needed to gather at the clubhouse immediately. The language was dramatic, almost theatrical, and so clearly written by Karen that it might as well have come with her signature scent of cheap perfume and outrage. I walked to the clubhouse with several neighbors, all of us curious about her next move, and inside we found Karen standing proudly on the small stage in front of a whiteboard covered in chaotic diagrams, arrows, circles, and words like boat seizure protocol, unauthorized trespasser, and emergency HOA intervention. The board members stood behind her looking like regretful statues. She began the meeting by announcing that the community was in danger because an individual had violated multiple HOA rules, endangered residents, and attempted to undermine neighborhood harmony. She then pointed directly at me like a prosecutor announcing her prime suspect. A wave of irritation moved through the crowd. People started shifting, whispering, and rolling their eyes, and for the first time Karen looked slightly unsure of herself. She tried to continue her speech, describing me as uncooperative, aggressive, and hostile toward community laws, and when she stated that she had confiscated my boat to protect residents from my reckless behavior, several people actually laughed out loud. One man asked why she was patrolling a lake that doesn't belong to the HOA. Another asked how she planned to explain the videos circulating online of her zigzagging across the lake like a drunken pelican. Karen snapped that the videos were misleading, taken out of context, and part of a smear campaign, but nobody was buying it. She kept insisting that she had the right to take my boat because it was causing dangerous wake disturbances even though the water had been perfectly calm. She claimed she had been trained in water safety management, a statement that surprised everyone including the board members. Someone asked where she got her training, and she proudly declared she had taken an online quiz once, making the room erupt in confusion. The more she talked, the deeper she sank into her own delusion. When she brought up HOA Ordinance 19 subsection 3 again, I stepped forward calmly and asked her to show the exact page in the bylaws where this ordinance was written. She froze, realized she had been caught, and began flipping through the binder rapidly, pretending she had simply misplaced it. The binder slammed shut in frustration when she couldn't find anything, and she blamed the board for not updating the documents properly. That was the moment everything shifted. A neighbor stood up and demanded her resignation. Another supported the call. Then another. And another. Karen panicked and yelled that this was a coup, a conspiracy orchestrated by rule breakers who wanted to destroy the community. She pointed at me again, blaming me for turning people against her, claiming that I was some kind of manipulative mastermind trying to destabilize the HOA. I simply lifted the deed in my hand and reminded her that the lake was private property, and by taking my boat she had committed theft, trespassing, and vandalism. The room exploded with gasps and murmurs. Karen looked like her soul had floated out of her body. Every board member quietly stepped away from her. It was clear that her reign was falling apart. But chaos has a way of resisting finality, and just when it seemed like Karen was about to break, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and declared that she would not step down. Then she announced something that made every jaw drop in the room. She was filing an emergency HOA claim to seize the lake. That was when I knew Chapter 4 was about to get explosive. You said. The moment Karen announced that she was filing an emergency HOA claim to seize the lake, the entire clubhouse reacted like someone had lit a fuse in a room full of fireworks, with neighbors gasping, scoffing, whispering, and staring at her as if she had finally proven what they secretly suspected all along, that she had completely lost her mind. She stood there with trembling confidence, shoulders back, chin raised, convinced that speaking loudly enough would transform her fantasy into legal reality, while the board members behind her looked like they were trapped inside a sinking ship they never volunteered to board. I stepped forward slowly, not out of aggression but disbelief that she genuinely thought this dramatic declaration would intimidate me or anyone else. She began drawing wild circles and arrows on the whiteboard, explaining that because the HOA had authority over community aesthetics and environmental safety, and because the lake touched the boundary of HOA homes, she could legally claim it as part of shared amenities. Several neighbors raised their hands just to ask if she had eaten something strange that morning, but she ignored them and continued ranting about how the lake was vital to the neighborhood's beauty and therefore belonged under community supervision, which in her mind meant under her personal rule. One elderly woman asked her gently if she understood how property rights worked, and Karen barked that property rights were irrelevant when the greater good of the community was at stake. The room fell into a mix of shock and amusement as she lectured everyone with the fierce determination of someone who had read half a blog post and believed she was now a legal expert. The sheriff, who had stayed to witness the meeting in case things escalated, pinched the bridge of his nose and murmured something that sounded like "Here we go again." Karen, trying to rally support, asked the room who among them wanted a safer, more orderly neighborhood, but only a couple of people raised their hands hesitantly, and even they quickly lowered them when others glared. She spun toward me dramatically and accused me of being selfish, irresponsible, a danger to the peace, and worst of all a rule breaker who thought he was above the community. But when she tried to paint me as the villain, the audience responded with chuckles instead of fear. I raised the deed once again and reminded her that the lake had been privately owned long before the HOA was ever established, and just because she wished it belonged to the community did not make it so. Karen interrupted me, shouting that the HOA would win if this went to court because judges always sided with communities trying to protect themselves, but her voice cracked in the middle of her rant, exposing the shaky foundation beneath her confidence. I calmly told her that no judge would grant her ownership over land that wasn't hers, water that wasn't hers, and a lake whose legal boundaries were documented down to the square inch. She threw her arms up dramatically and accused me of hoarding natural resources, which made someone in the back burst into laughter. Growing more frantic, she scribbled a makeshift document on the whiteboard titled Emergency Lake Reallocation Proposal and claimed that as HOA president she had the right to reassign land for community benefit. The sheriff walked over, looked at the board, and asked her softly if she understood that none of her claims held any legal weight. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, insisting that if she filed enough paperwork and sent enough emails to county offices, someone somewhere would approve her request, and that once it was approved I would be forced to comply. Neighbors began whispering that they needed new leadership immediately. One woman stood up and said she would be starting a petition to remove Karen from her position, citing abuse of power, harassment, and delusional decision-making. The room erupted with support for the idea. Karen spun around, furious, and screamed that they had no right to replace her because she had dedicated years of her life to this community, enforcing rules day and night, sacrificing her personal time for the sanity of everyone here, which made several people quietly question whose sanity she was talking about. The sheriff attempted to calm her by explaining that filing false claims or attempting to seize private property could result in criminal charges, but Karen refused to listen, insisting that she was the only one standing between order and chaos. She stormed off the stage, marched out of the clubhouse, and slammed the door so hard it rattled the windows. The room fell into a thick, heavy silence as everyone processed what had just unfolded. The board members looked at each other and then at me as if silently asking for direction. I told them they needed to act quickly because Karen was on a collision course with legal disaster, and if she dragged the HOA into her spiraling madness, they would all suffer. Several neighbors volunteered to form an emergency oversight committee to temporarily suspend her authority. The sheriff agreed to stand by in case she escalated further. A group began drafting her removal petition, while others started gathering evidence to protect themselves if she retaliated. I quietly called the county office to inform them that a potentially false claim might be submitted by someone unhinged, and they assured me they would flag any suspicious paperwork immediately. Just as the meeting was wrapping up, someone burst through the door panting and explained that Karen had gone to the HOA office and locked herself inside, claiming she was activating emergency powers. Everyone rushed outside, gathering near the office windows where they could hear her frantically typing and shouting at the printer for not spitting out her paperwork fast enough. The sheriff knocked gently and told her to step out, but she screamed that no one would stop her and that she would secure the lake no matter what. That was the moment she made her biggest mistake yet. She hit the emergency broadcast button the HOA normally used only for things like wild animal alerts or dangerous weather, and a loud alarm echoed through every home, followed by her shrill voice declaring that the lake was now under HOA control and that all residents must stay off it until further notice. Panic rippled through the neighborhood not because they believed her, but because they realized how far she was willing to go. People gathered around me, asking what to do next. I told them not to worry, because her declaration had just shifted the situation from local drama to legal emergency, and once she hit that button, she inadvertently committed an act that county authorities would not ignore. I looked toward the lake, the sun reflecting calmly across the water, and I knew then that Karen had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Chapter 5 was going to be the moment everything snapped. The piercing emergency alarm echoing across the entire neighborhood created a moment of frozen disbelief as every resident stepped out onto their porches, lawns, and driveways, staring around in confusion while Karen's frantic voice blared through the speakers declaring the lake officially seized by the HOA and under her direct authority for the protection of the community. Her words sounded more like the rant of someone unraveling rather than any official announcement, and neighbors exchanged uneasy glances as children stopped their bikes, dogs barked nervously, and even the birds seemed to pause mid-chirp, sensing the sheer absurdity in the air. I stood among the gathering crowd, watching as people whispered urgently, some laughing at the ridiculousness of it, others clearly concerned that Karen had crossed the boundary between overbearing leadership and outright delusion. The sheriff sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead, knowing that her misuse of the emergency system wasn't just dramatic but legally significant. Emergency broadcasts were county-regulated, and using them for personal or HOA-related nonsense could bring serious consequences. As the residents began gravitating toward the HOA office, I followed with them, the tension growing with each step as Karen's muffled yelling leaked through the door, accompanied by the sound of papers being thrown, drawers slamming, and what suspiciously sounded like her yelling at the copier for refusing to print her emergency lake seizure forms quickly enough. When the sheriff knocked and calmly demanded she open the door, she shouted that she was too busy securing the community to entertain traitors and rule breakers, and that no one would sabotage her mission to bring order to the neighborhood. The crowd murmured angrily now, finally seeing her not as a strict leader but as a loose cannon capable of dragging the entire HOA into legal ruin. The The sheriff warned her that refusal to comply with law enforcement orders could result in immediate consequences, but she yelled back that she outranked him within community jurisdiction, a statement that caused several residents to groan loudly and one older man to mutter that he'd seen cult leaders with more self-awareness. When the sheriff finally announced that he was authorized to enter the building due to her misuse of emergency systems, Karen shrieked, grabbed something heavy, and barricaded the door. The crowd gasped as the sheriff signaled 2 deputies to assist, and within moments they were preparing to force entry if necessary. Inside, Karen was screaming into a phone call, demanding that the county office approve her lake claim immediately, insisting she had full community support and that the safety of the entire region was at risk. The county representative, confused and increasingly irritated, apparently kept explaining that she had no legal standing to make such a claim, but Karen refused to accept it, yelling that she would not let bureaucratic incompetence derail her plans. When the sheriff finally entered, pushing past the broken latch, they found Karen standing in the middle of the office surrounded by scattered papers, overturned chairs, and a cracked whiteboard lying on the floor like a battlefield casualty. Her hair was disheveled, her face red, eyes wild, and she clutched a handful of printed documents that she waved like victory flags. She screamed at the sheriff to get out, saying he had no authority to interfere with HOA emergency operations, but the sheriff calmly informed her that she had committed several violations including misuse of emergency systems, obstruction, attempted false emergency filing, and possibly even endangerment due to causing panic. Karen immediately accused him of being bribed by me, claiming that I was desperate to hide my illegal lake activities, an accusation so absurd that half the neighbors outside burst into nervous laughter. When she spotted me standing behind the sheriff, she pointed at me like an enraged prosecutor, yelling that I was the one destabilizing the community and that her actions were justified because she was fighting a one-man rebellion against HOA order. I took a slow step forward and told her she needed to calm down before she destroyed not only her position but her entire future, but she screamed that I should be arrested for manipulating the community and stealing resources from the HOA. I asked her gently how I could have stolen something I legally owned long before the HOA even existed. Her face twitched with frustration as she struggled to craft a response that made sense even to herself. When the sheriff informed her she would need to come outside and cooperate with the investigation, she took a wild step backward, clutching her papers like a shield, and yelled that she invoked HOA emergency immunity, a phrase she had clearly invented on the spot. The deputies exchanged looks of disbelief. Karen, realizing she was cornered, tried one last desperate move. She grabbed her stack of papers and ran toward the back door of the office, tripping over a fallen chair and crashing into the wall. The deputies reached her before she could recover and guided her outside, where the entire neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Parents held their children close, elderly residents muttered prayers, teens recorded everything, and nearly everyone waited to see the final outcome. Karen stumbled forward, still raging, still insisting she had done nothing wrong, and that she alone cared about the community. When the sheriff read her rights calmly, her expression collapsed into disbelief, as if she never imagined that her imaginary power could ever fail her. She begged the board members to intervene, but they stared at the ground, ashamed and exhausted. She demanded the neighbors defend her, but they shook their heads, murmuring for her to stop. Then she turned to me with a look that held fury, heartbreak, confusion, and denial, and she hissed that this wasn't over and that she would return stronger than ever. I met her gaze without smugness or satisfaction, simply with the quiet certainty that the path she had chosen had consequences she never prepared for. The sheriff guided her gently toward the patrol car, and as she walked past the lake, she yelled one last threat that she would someday find a way to take it. The crowd collectively exhaled as the car door closed and the vehicle pulled away slowly. People looked relieved yet shaken, and several turned to me asking what would happen next. I told them the legal process was beginning now, and that Karen's future with the HOA was over. They asked if the drama was finally done, But as I looked across the water, watching the sunlight ripple across the lake, I knew this wasn't the end. Big stories don't end with the villain being removed. Big stories end with what happens after. And in this case, the aftermath was about to be even more dramatic, because Karen wasn't just a problem removed, she was a storm waiting to strike again, and Chapter 6 would reveal exactly how far her chaos would reach. In the days following Karen's arrest, the neighborhood moved with a strange mix of relief and lingering unease, as if everyone was finally breathing again but still glancing over their shoulders wondering if the storm had truly passed, because someone like Karen never simply disappears from chaos she creates, she lingers in the cracks, plotting her next dramatic explosion. The HOA office remained half destroyed from her meltdown, papers scattered everywhere, broken furniture dragged aside, and a cracked emergency broadcast panel taped over like a wound the community was trying to forget. People began approaching me with updates and rumors they heard about her, whispering like they were sharing ghost stories. Some said she had been temporarily released pending investigation, others claimed she was already lawyering up, and a few insisted she was planning to sue the county, the sheriff, the HOA, and even me for emotional distress. It was all speculation, but knowing Karen, none of it seemed impossible. The HOA board held an emergency election to replace her, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood clubhouse felt alive with hopeful energy instead of fear. Neighbors cheered when the new president, a calm retired teacher named Mrs. Bramble, was voted in unanimously. She promised to restore peace, dismantle unnecessary rules, and repair the damage caused by Karen's obsession with control. The members applauded, relieved to finally have leadership rooted in sanity. But as they celebrated, a county official pulled me aside to inform me that Karen had already contacted at least 7 different departments claiming she was being targeted, that the community was in rebellion, and that the lake was essential for HOA environmental programs. Each office rejected her, but her persistence was alarming. I thanked the official, realizing that Karen's arrest had not humbled her, it had simply redirected her determination. The next morning, an envelope slid under my door with my name written in large chaotic handwriting that could only belong to Karen. Inside was a handwritten letter bursting with dramatic threats and delusional claims. She wrote that she would return to reclaim what was hers, that she had uncovered new evidence proving the lake belonged to the HOA, and that I would pay dearly for humiliating her. She also added a strange sentence about having powerful allies who were watching everything. The tone was so wildly unstable that for a moment I wondered if she was spiraling deeper than any of us realized. I took the letter to the sheriff, who examined it and sighed, saying the investigation was still underway and any direct harassment from her was now part of the case against her. He added that she might be reaching a breaking point and advised me to be cautious because unpredictable people make unpredictable decisions. His seriousness sent a chill down my spine. Later that afternoon, the new HOA president held an open neighborhood meeting to discuss repairs, new policies, and ways to move forward. People filled the room again, but this time there was laughter, kindness, and an almost festive atmosphere. Someone brought cookies. Someone else brought coffee. For once, the HOA felt like a community gathering instead of a court summons. I was helping Mrs. Bramble sort through old, unnecessary HOA rules when a neighbor burst into the room, panting and wide-eyed. Everyone turned toward him, and the excitement died instantly. He said someone had seen Karen earlier near the lake, dressed in dark clothes, pacing near the shoreline like she was searching for something. Instantly, the room filled with worried whispers. How was she near the lake? Wasn't she supposed to be under restrictions? Was she planning something? Without hesitation, a group of us walked quickly toward the water, and sure enough, there she was standing at the edge of the lake with her hair a mess, her clothes dusty, and her face twisted into an expression that mixed frustration and desperation. She was holding a thick folder stuffed with papers that she waved around like a lunatic conducting an invisible orchestra. When she spotted me approaching with the neighbors, her eyes lit up with some twisted sense of triumph. She marched toward us shouting that she had found the ultimate proof, that she had discovered a loophole, that the lake had been mislabeled on an old county map decades ago. She held up a faded piece of paper and shook it violently as if it were a sacred text proving her claims. The neighbors exchanged confused glances. I took the paper gently from her hand and looked at it. It wasn't even a legal document. It was an outdated tourist brochure showing a general illustration of the area from 30 years earlier. The lake wasn't even drawn accurately. I handed it back, telling her calmly that it wasn't evidence of anything, but she snapped, screaming that everyone was conspiring against her, that the world was full of incompetent fools, and that she alone understood the truth. Mrs. Bramble tried speaking softly, telling her she needed help, but Karen shouted at her to be quiet, declaring that the only leader this neighborhood ever had was her. She then turned toward the lake and began shouting dramatic declarations like she was delivering a villain monologue, claiming the lake was hers by destiny, hers by stewardship, hers by the will of the community she insisted she protected. I finally stepped closer and told her she had to stop before she ruined her life even further. She stared at me with eyes that looked hollow, wild, and tired. Then she whispered something I hadn't expected. She said she couldn't stop because she had nothing left except this fight. For a moment, the anger, the fury, the madness fell away, leaving behind something sad and broken. But then it snapped back violently. She suddenly bolted toward the dock and grabbed a paddle boat that belonged to one of the neighbors. Before anyone could stop her, she pushed it into the water, climbed in, and started paddling frantically toward the center of the lake while shouting that if she couldn't seize the lake legally, she would take it physically. The crowd stood stunned as she paddled in circles, screaming at the top of her lungs about reclaiming her authority. The sheriff, who had been patrolling nearby, heard the commotion and ran toward us, cursing under his breath when he saw her in the middle of the lake. He radioed for backup and called out to her, telling her to return to shore immediately. She refused, shouting that she wouldn't surrender the lake to traitors and cowards. The sheriff prepared a small rescue boat while the neighborhood held its breath, watching Karen slowly unravel under the afternoon sun. And as I watched her losing herself in the middle of the water she insisted she controlled, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Chapter 7 would be the moment everything tore apart once and for all. You said. The sight of Karen paddling wildly in circles at the center of the lake created a surreal tension that wrapped around the entire neighborhood like a heavy fog, because no one could fully comprehend how a simple HOA dispute had spiraled into a spectacle that looked like a dramatic movie scene mixed with pure chaos and desperation. The sheriff stood at the shoreline preparing the small rescue boat while muttering that he had never in his career seen an HOA president attempt to physically occupy a lake as a form of protest. Neighbors gathered behind him, some anxious, some whispering prayers, others recording cautiously, unsure whether this would become a cautionary tale or a memory they would laugh about years later. Children clung to their parents' legs, pets barked nervously, and even the ripples across the water seemed to carry tension as Karen paddled harder, shouting about betrayal, injustice, and the sacred responsibility of leadership. Her voice echoed over the calm surface, cracking with exhaustion and emotional strain, and as she circled aimlessly, the sun glinting off the water made her look oddly small, like a single stubborn figure refusing to accept the truth staring her in the face. The sheriff finally launched the rescue boat, slowly navigating toward her while speaking into his radio, explaining that the situation had escalated into a mental health and safety emergency. I stood at the edge of the dock watching, feeling a strange mixture of concern and disbelief, because though Karen had caused chaos, lawsuits, harassment, and endless drama, seeing her unravel like this did not bring satisfaction. Instead it revealed how deeply her identity had become tied to her position, how losing control had shattered something inside her. As the sheriff approached, he called out firmly that she needed to stop, come aboard, and return to shore for her own safety. She refused, screaming that stepping off the boat meant surrender, and that surrender was death. Her words were frantic, dramatic, and full of fear, and the sheriff, realizing verbal reasoning would not work, slowly maneuvered to block her path. She tried to paddle around him, but the paddle boat was slow and clumsy, and she only managed to turn herself sideways while shouting that the universe was on her side. He reached out cautiously, telling her he did not want to escalate force, but she swung her paddle at him, splashing water and shouting that he would never take her alive. The neighbors gasped in horror as the paddle struck the side of the rescue boat, nearly tipping her fragile craft. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze as her paddle boat wobbled dangerously, and she scrambled to regain balance. Her face flooded with fear as the boat lurched, tipping halfway before stabilizing with a slap against the water. The sheriff kept his voice calm but firm, telling her the situation was now dangerous. Karen refused to listen, still clinging to the narrative that she was fighting for her rights, that she was the real victim, and that everyone else was blinded by lies. Her voice cracked mid-sentence, and she suddenly began crying, large heaving sobs mixing with incoherent accusations. She cried that all she wanted was respect, that all she ever did was try to protect the community, that no one appreciated her sacrifices, and that people were constantly breaking rules, forcing her to act. Her breakdown was raw and messy, and while some neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, others softened at the sight of her unraveling. Even I felt a pang of pity as I watched her, because beneath the anger and delusion was a person who had lost herself entirely. The sheriff edged closer and reached out again, gently this time, telling her that no one was her enemy, that she needed help, and that this was not the way to solve anything. She stared at him through tears, trembling, her grip on the paddle loosening. For a moment it seemed she would finally surrender and step onto the rescue boat, ending the chaos without further harm. But just as she reached forward, a gust of wind hit the lake, pushing the paddleboat sideways. Karen panicked, grabbed the edge, and lost her balance as the boat tilted sharply. Neighbors screamed as she toppled into the water with a splash that shattered the tense silence. The sheriff reacted instantly, diving in before anyone could blink. The water churned as he reached her, grabbing her arm and pulling her up before she could sink beneath the surface. She thrashed in panic, coughing and screaming, terrified and disoriented, but he held her securely, guiding her toward the rescue boat. Neighbors rushed to the shoreline, hands covering mouths, hearts pounding as they watched the sheriff lift her onto the boat. She clung to the edge, sobbing uncontrollably, shivering from shock and fear, her once proud posture completely gone. As the sheriff slowly brought her back to shore, silence fell over the entire neighborhood. When the boat docked, paramedics stepped forward, helping her onto a stretcher. She kept muttering fragmented sentences, claiming she had been protecting the lake, accusing invisible enemies of plotting against her, insisting she was misunderstood. The paramedics glanced at each other, exchanging subtle signals, recognizing the signs of emotional collapse. They gently secured her, assuring her that she was safe. As they wheeled her away, she lifted her head just enough to look at me. Her eyes, once full of fire and stubborn confidence, were now exhausted, confused, and hollow, yet still clinging to fragments of anger. She whispered that this was not the end, that she would return, and that she would make everything right again. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. She had lost the battle, the authority, and perhaps even pieces of herself. The sheriff placed a hand on my shoulder and told me the county would take things from here, that she would undergo evaluations, and that legal proceedings would continue separately. The neighbors gathered in a large silent circle, watching the ambulance drive away. Some cried, others sighed, and some simply stood there stunned. No one cheered. No one celebrated. It felt less like victory and more like the aftermath of a storm that had uprooted everything in its path. As people slowly returned to their homes, I looked out over the lake, now still and quiet, the water reflecting the fading sky. Chapter 8, I realized, would not just be about the end of the conflict, but about rebuilding, healing, and discovering the final truth about why Karen had fought so desperately for something that was never hers. In the days that followed Karen's dramatic rescue and removal from the neighborhood, an unusual calm settled over the community, the kind that comes only after a long storm finally burns itself out, leaving behind a silence so thick it feels almost foreign. Neighbors walked the streets more slowly, speaking softer, breathing easier, as if relearning what peace felt like after months of tension. The lake, once a battleground for ego and imagined authority, now reflected the sky with untouched serenity, its surface undisturbed except for the gentle wake of ducks drifting across. I found myself standing on my dock more often, simply listening to the wind and the water, processing everything that had unfolded, because it was not just a battle with an HOA president, it was the unraveling of a person who had built her entire identity on power she never truly had. The new HOA president, Mrs. Bramble, visited me one morning carrying a folder stuffed with documents that the county had sent her. She explained quietly that the charges against Karen were still being sorted, ranging from misuse of emergency systems to property interference and resisting lawful orders, but what concerned her most was the psychological evaluation report, which suggested a collapse brought on by overwhelming stress, isolation, and an obsessive need for control that spiraled far beyond normal boundaries. It seemed Karen had been carrying far more weight on her shoulders than anyone realized, not because the community demanded it, but because she demanded it of herself. According to the evaluation, she believed deeply that without her, the neighborhood would fall into chaos, that she alone kept everything running, and that losing authority meant losing her purpose. As I listened, something in me softened, not enough to erase what she had done, but enough to recognize that she had not been operating from malice alone. She had been lost inside her own fears. The community slowly began to heal, piece by piece. The emergency broadcast system was repaired and placed under strict county oversight. Unnecessary HOA rules were removed or rewritten to be reasonable and humane. Fines were reversed for anyone Karen had penalized unfairly. A new committee was formed to ensure no single person ever held unchecked authority again. For the first time in years, neighbors felt like they had a voice. People hosted barbecues, kids played freely near the lake, and the sense of community that had been crushed under Karen's rule slowly re-emerged. One afternoon, while I was repainting the dock railing, the sheriff visited. He stood beside me quietly for a moment before saying that Karen had requested to speak with me. At first I hesitated. After everything, I was unsure whether facing her again would help either of us. But the sheriff assured me she was no longer combative, that therapy had grounded her, and that the meeting might bring closure. So I agreed. We drove to a small outpatient facility where she was receiving treatment. The building was quiet, peaceful, with soft murmuring fountains and sunlight filtering through tall windows. When Karen entered the room, she looked different, not physically but spiritually, as if the sharp edges she once carried had finally dulled. She sat down slowly, avoiding eye contact at first, her hands folded tightly. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she whispered an apology, the kind that comes not from obligation but from exhaustion and clarity. She said she never intended for things to go so far, that she truly believed she was protecting the community, and that somewhere along the way she lost sight of what actually mattered. She admitted that the power made her feel important, needed, and in control of a life that otherwise felt empty. She confessed that losing her job last year, her divorce, and her children moving away left her feeling useless, and the HOA role became the only thing that made her feel alive. Listening to her, I realized that while she had caused chaos, she was not evil. She was broken, lonely, and desperately trying to build stability in the only way she knew, even if it was misguided and destructive. I told her I accepted her apology, not to absolve her actions but to release both of us from the bitterness that had overshadowed everything. She nodded with teary eyes, saying she wanted to make things right someday, even if she could never return to the HOA. The sheriff escorted me out afterward, and as we stepped into the sunlight, He admitted he had seen countless cases where authority destroyed people from the inside out, but Karen was one of the rare ones who might actually rebuild herself. Back in the neighborhood, life continued to move forward in ways that felt almost magical after the months of turmoil. The community came together more tightly than before, as if the shared chaos had bonded them. Neighbors organized a lake cleanup day, not because of HOA pressure but because they wanted to enjoy the space together. Kids held fishing contests. Someone brought a grill. Someone else brought music. Laughter echoed across the water. Mrs. Bramble approached me during the event and asked if I would consider serving on a new advisory board to help keep the HOA transparent and fair. I agreed, not for authority but because I realized that communities thrive when people share responsibility instead of giving it all to one person. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water gold and orange, I felt a profound sense of closure settling in. The lake, once the center of conflict, now felt like a symbol of renewal. People who once feared stepping outside during Karen's reign were now gathering freely, forming friendships, rebuilding trust. I looked around at families laughing, at neighbors talking warmly, at the sheriff chatting with kids about boat safety, and I realized the story wasn't about an HOA president losing control. It was about a community rediscovering itself, learning to stand together, and understanding that power is safest when shared, not seized. And as I sat at the end of my dock watching the peaceful ripples across my lake, I knew that everything had come full circle. The chaos had ended. The peace had returned. And the lake, mine by law but now everyone's in spirit, reflected the truth that no matter how heavy the storm, calm always finds its way back home.